Her wedding was ruined by her dog. Then she realized why. The morning was serene, yet charged with a quiet intensity. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting golden patterns on the smooth wooden floor. The room bore echoes of a life well lived, a scuffed desk with faded doodles, a corkboard dotted with memories of adventures, and a worn ribbon from a childhood victory. In the center stood Sarah Matthews, her reflection in the mirror both poised and unfamiliar. The ivory dress hugged her frame like a dream, the lace a testament to countless nights imagining this moment. She adjusted the veil atop her auburn curls, her deliberate movements betraying the nervous energy simmering beneath her calm facade. At her feet, Max, her aging German shepherd, lay silently. His grey-tinged fur caught the sunlight, and his amber eyes tracked her every move with quiet devotion. The photo on her nightstand whispered their shared history. A younger Sarah cradling a scruffy puppy, both brimming with unbridled joy. Max stirred, his ears twitching toward faint footsteps in the hallway. His joints creaked as he shifted, rising with effort but purpose. Though age had slowed him, his spirit was as steadfast as ever. A knock at the door shattered the stillness. Sarah's gaze darted to Max, seeking reassurance in his familiar presence. She knelt, her hand brushing his fur in a lingering touch, before she turned toward the door. Max hesitated, his intense gaze never leaving her. Then, with measured determination, he stood and followed, not with youthful energy, but with the enduring loyalty of a companion who understood his place. Beyond the door the day awaited, meticulously planned and perfect, but inside the bond between a woman and her dog radiated a quiet strength, one soon to be tested in ways neither could yet foresee. In Max's steady amber eyes there lingered something unspoken, a weight Sarah hadn't noticed before. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe if you're a fan of heartwarming tales and incredible animal stories. The living room pulsed with life, every corner a flurry of movement. The sound of curling irons snapping shut, makeup brushes swishing against palettes, and muffled instructions filled the air. Bouquets of soft blue and ivory flowers rested on the dining table, surrounded by champagne flutes and ribbons still waiting to be tied. The faint hum of excitement in the room was unmistakable, but beneath it all, there was an almost imperceptible rhythm, a presence that tethered it together. Sarah sat near the window, sunlight dancing over her as she leaned slightly forward, the lines of her wedding dress shifting with her breath. She was still, but not idle. Her gaze roamed over the bustling scene, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing the fabric of her dress. She smiled at a comment from one of her bridesmaids, though the weight of the day pressed on her in ways she hadn't expected. At her feet, Max stayed close. His body, solid and dependable, seemed like an anchor amidst the commotion. The German shepherd's amber eyes followed Sarah's movements, as if memorizing her every shift and gesture. Though the room moved at a frenetic pace, Max did not. His calm, a stark contrast to the excitement that filled the space. Elizabeth swept through the room like a conductor, her sharp eye catching every detail, from the placement of a flower to the position of the hairdresser's chair. Her steps were measured, her tone efficient but warm as she directed the preparations. The clipboard in her hand was filled with notes, last-minute checkboxes, and scribbled reminders. Nearby, Jenny perched on the arm of Sarah's chair, her expression lighter than Elizabeth's, but her concern no less genuine. Her gaze dropped to Max, lingering as she noticed his stillness. His ears, usually perked and alert, barely flicked in response to the noise around him. Jenny leaned in closer, her voice low enough to keep the observation between them. "He's not himself today, is he?" Sarah didn't immediately respond. Her hand drifted to Max's head, her fingers brushing over his fur with a quiet familiarity. His tail gave a weak thump against the floor, but it lacked its usual vigor. "He's probably just picking up on the excitement," Sarah murmured, her tone gentle but uncertain. "You know how he is." Jenny didn't press, but her eyes said enough. Max shifted slightly, his body pressing closer to Sarah's legs, his head tilting to meet her touch. The room bustled on, unaware of the quiet exchange. A sharp voice rose above the commotion. The wedding planner entered, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she moved with practiced purpose. "Sarah, time for photos. We're right on schedule." Elizabeth nodded her approval, already moving to ensure the next task was handled seamlessly. "Let's get moving, sweetheart," she said, her tone a blend of affection and urgency. Sarah stood, smoothing her dress as the moment's demands pulled her attention. Max rose with her, his movements slower than they once were, a deliberate effort that didn't escape Jenny's notice. He followed Sarah as closely as he always had, his body brushing against her legs as if drawn by an invisible thread. Jenny watched the pair, her usual wit tempered by an unease she couldn't quite name. The bridesmaids gathered their belongings, their chatter rising as the next phase of the day began to unfold. Amid the laughter and clinking glasses, Max stayed by Sarah's side, moving as her shadow, his silent presence speaking louder than any word. The garden was radiant, every detail basking in the golden embrace of autumn sunlight. The sprawling oak tree at its center stood as if it had grown there just for this moment, its branches framing the scene like a natural cathedral. The air carried the faint scent of freshly fallen leaves, mingling with the distant murmur of arriving guests. Sarah stood beneath the tree, the lace of her wedding dress glinting softly in the light. Her bouquet, an arrangement of delicate blues and whites, rested lightly in her hands as the photographer gave gentle instructions from a few steps away. The atmosphere was serene, almost surreal in its perfection, a dream materialized. Max lingered close, his presence a comforting shadow. His usual curiosity seemed muted, his steps slower, as he paced the perimeter of the scene, his gaze never straying far from Sarah. The photographer adjusted their angle, gesturing towards Sarah with encouraging energy. "Perfect. Let's get you stepping forward, just a little. That light is gorgeous right now." Sarah smiled, moving to comply, but as soon as she took a step, Max shifted. He moved with sudden purpose, planting himself firmly in front of her. His body blocked her path entirely, his stance unwavering. The action drew a ripple of surprise. The bridesmaids exchanged puzzled glances, and the photographer lowered their camera slightly, unsure how to proceed. Sarah tilted her head, her brow furrowing as she looked down at Max. "Max," she said softly, her voice carrying more confusion than reprimand, "move aside, buddy." Max's ears flicked, but he didn't budge. His soulful amber eyes locked onto hers, filled with something she couldn't immediately place. Then, as she stepped closer, she noticed it. The slight tremor running through his legs. The garden, so alive with sunlight and color, seemed to dim around her. Kneeling carefully in her dress, Sarah reached out to him. Her fingers brushed the fur along his side, and her expression shifted from puzzlement to concern. His breathing, usually steady and unremarkable, came in faintly labored bursts, each rise and fall of his chest slower than it should have been. The chatter of the bridesmaids faded into the background. The photographer, now frozen in place, glanced nervously toward Sarah's father, who stood nearby. The older man began to step forward, but something in Sarah's posture kept him at a respectful distance. "Hey, boy," Sarah murmured, her voice dropping lower, as if speaking to a frightened child. Her hand moved gently along his back, trying to steady the tremor in his legs through touch alone. "What's going on?" Max didn't resist her attention. If anything, he leaned into it, his head lowering slightly until his muzzle brushed against her arm. His body, warm against her hands, felt heavier than it should have. Behind her, someone, Jenny perhaps, spoke up. Maybe he just needs to walk or some water. The suggestion hung in the air, practical but hollow. Sarah barely acknowledged it. Her focus was entirely on Max now, on the quiet signals he was sending with each subtle movement. Her mother's voice broke the spell, sharp with a hint of impatience. "Sarah, we need to keep moving. The guests are starting to arrive, and we still have photos to take." Sarah didn't respond immediately. Her hand lingered on Max's fur, her mind racing through possibilities. For the first time that day, the careful structure of her plans began to feel fragile, ready to collapse under the weight of something far more urgent. Her father stepped closer, his voice quieter than Elizabeth's but no less firm. "Sarah, honey, what do you want to do?" Max's head rested against her shoulder now, his eyes closed as if even holding them open had become too much. Sarah inhaled deeply, her gaze moving from Max to the tree, to the church in the distance where Michael waited, and back again. A decision loomed, heavy and immediate. The photographer hesitated, their lens lowered now, waiting for some sign to proceed. Sarah's hand, still resting on Max, tightened slightly, a silent promise forming in her mind. The clinic doors swing open with a sharp burst of energy, the sound of hurried footsteps cutting through the sterile stillness of the lobby. Sarah steps in, her wedding dress trailing behind her in a crumpled cloud of lace and silk. Her hands are steady, but her face is a storm of emotion. Fear, guilt, and urgency, all battling for control. Max follows closely, his gait slower than ever, his breath shallow and uneven. Dr. Peterson, a man in his 60s with kind eyes behind thin glasses, looks up from a clipboard at the front desk. His gaze lands on Sarah, her dress, and then on Max. The concern in his expression deepens immediately. "Sarah," he says, moving toward her, his voice calm but edged with urgency, "let's get him into the exam room. Now!" Without a word, Sarah nods, her hand resting lightly on Max's back as they follow Dr. Peterson through the hallway. The walls are lined with posters of cheerful pets, their bright eyes and wagging tails a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere pressing in. Dr. Peterson gestures toward a padded table. Sarah hesitates for a moment, her hands trembling as she helps Max onto the surface. He lies down heavily, his body seeming to sink into the padding. Dr. Peterson works methodically, his experienced hands moving over Max with a careful thoroughness. He listens to his heartbeat, examines his breathing, and runs his hands gently along the joints that had grown stiff over the years. All the while, Sarah stands just inches away, her fingers clutching the edge of the table as though letting go would mean losing her balance entirely. Finally, Dr. Peterson steps back, his expression serious but not unkind. He removes his stethoscope and takes a slow breath before speaking. "Sarah," he begins, his voice steady. "Max is showing signs of advanced heart failure. His age, combined with the stress of today, has likely pushed his heart to its limit." Sarah's lips part as though to speak, but no words come out. She glances down at Max, who turns his head slightly toward her, his amber eyes still soft and full of trust. Dr. Peterson continues, his tone gentle but firm. "And he's been trying to tell you something's wrong," he says. "Dogs don't have words, so they show us in other ways. Staying close to you today, refusing to let you out of his sight, that was his way of asking for help." The weight of those words lands hard, and Sarah's knees nearly buckle. She steadies herself against the table, tears welling in her eyes. What can we do?" she asks, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Peterson meets her gaze directly, his own eyes filled with compassion. "We can start him on medication immediately," he says. "It won't cure the condition, but it can help manage the symptoms and make him more comfortable. That said, he hesitates, choosing his words carefully. Given his age and the severity of the condition, we're looking at months, not years. Sarah presses a hand to her mouth, the tears spilling over now. Max's breathing is shallow but steady, and his eyes remain locked on hers, as if he's waiting for her to decide what happens next. Dr. Peterson steps forward, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You've given him a long, happy life, Sarah. This is about making sure whatever time he has left is spent in comfort, surrounded by the people he loves most. Sarah nods slowly, her free hand moving to rest on Max's fur. Her voice trembles, but there's resolve in her tone. Then we'll do whatever it takes, she says. He's always been there for me. I won't let him down now. Dr. Peterson offers a small, understanding smile. I'll prepare the first round of medication, he says. Stay with him. He'll feel better just knowing you're here. As Dr. Peterson leaves the room, Sarah lowers herself to sit beside the table, her dress pooling around her like a protective cocoon. She strokes Max's head gently, her tears falling freely now. It's okay, Max, she whispers, leaning close. We're gonna figure this out. You're not going anywhere, not without me. Max closes his eyes briefly, a quiet sigh escaping him as his body relaxes under her touch. For the first time that day, there's no rush, no overwhelming noise, just the quiet promise of being together, no matter what comes next. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a soft, clinical glow, dimming the warm hues of the sunset, peeking through the large front windows. The waiting room, usually quiet at this hour, now holds a strange mix of emotions: concern, hesitation, and the faint murmur of decisions being weighed. Sarah sits on a low bench, her wedding dress wrinkled and disheveled, a stark contrast to its earlier perfection. Her makeup, carefully applied just hours ago, is streaked with tears. She holds her phone loosely in her hands, scrolling aimlessly, but her mind is far from its screen. Across the room, Max rests on a blanket provided by one of the vet techs, his eyes half closed, but his breathing steadier now. The door opens, and Jenny steps in first, still in her bridesmaid dress, her hair pinned back but a little less pristine than earlier. Behind her is Michael, still in his tuxedo. His bow tie is loose, his jacket unbuttoned, and his expression a mixture of relief and worry as his eyes land on Sarah. Sarah, Michael says softly, crossing the room in long, purposeful strides. Jenny hangs back, giving them space. Sarah looks up, her lip trembling as she tries to form words, but nothing comes out. Michael kneels in front of her, his hands resting gently on hers. What happened? He asks, his voice steady but tender. Sarah glances over at Max, then back to Michael, her tears returning. Heart failure, she whispers, the words catching in her throat. The stress of today, it made it worse. Michael's eyes soften further as he pulls her into his arms. The fabric of his tuxedo brushes against the lace of her dress, and for a moment, the world outside this small circle seems to disappear. The wedding can wait, Michael says, his voice low but firm. He pulls back just enough to look her in the eye. Max is family, and family comes first. Sarah's hands tighten around his, a small sob escaping her as she nods. Jenny, watching the exchange, steps forward cautiously, her tone lighter but no less heartfelt. You know, she begins, her gaze flicking between them, we don't have to wait. The minister's at the church, right? I bet he'd come here if we asked. Sarah blinks, startled by the suggestion. Here? She echoes, glancing around the room. Jenny shrugs with a lopsided grin. Why not? It's not the oak tree, but it's not about where you get married, is it? It's about why. And Max, She pauses, looking over at the dog curled on the blanket. Max is part of your why. Michael raises an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It's unconventional, he admits, turning back to Sarah, but it's your call. Sarah's gaze shifts from Michael to Jenny, then to Max. Her fingers brush the skirt of her dress, now creased and far from its flawless beginnings. For a moment she hesitates, weighing the day she had planned against the reality unfolding before her. Max stirs slightly, lifting his head to glance at her. His tail gives the faintest thump against the blanket. The sight is enough to make Sarah's decision. She exhales a shaky breath and looks at Michael, her smile small but genuine. Let's do it, she says quietly. If Max can be here with us, it feels right. Jenny claps her hands together, already pulling out her phone. I'll make the calls, she announces, her voice cutting through the weight in the room. This is going to be the most memorable wedding anyone's ever seen. Michael presses a kiss to Sarah's forehead, his hand never leaving hers. Across the room, Max lays his head back down, his eyes closing again, as if content that his family is staying close. The waiting room feels different now, transformed by small, thoughtful touches. The harsh fluorescent lights are dimmed, replaced by the soft glow of candles hastily lit by the vet staff. Bouquets borrowed from the bridesmaids' arrangements are tucked into corners, their delicate colors softening the stark walls. A folded blanket serves as a makeshift altar at the center of the room, and the faint hum of the clinic's heating system fills the otherwise quiet space. Max lies on a blanket near the front, his head resting on his paws, his bow-tie collar freshly adjusted. His amber eyes are half-lidded, but his ears flick with quiet awareness of the scene unfolding around him. Sarah stands before Michael, her dress still wrinkled from the day's chaos, but she looks radiant in the candlelight. Her auburn curls fall loose around her shoulders now, the veil tucked carefully into place by Jenny, who stands beside her holding the bouquet. Michael, his tuxedo slightly askew, but his expression calm and focused, holds both of Sarah's hands in his. The small gathering, Jenny, Dr. Peterson, a couple of clinic staff and Sarah's parents, stands in a loose circle, their expressions warm with quiet awe at the intimacy of the moment. The minister, dressed in his church robes but with a look of easy adaptability, clears his throat gently, his tone reverent but informal. We are gathered here, he begins, not in the way that was planned, but in a way that feels uniquely fitting for this moment. Love has a way of reshaping our plans and guiding us toward what truly matters. Tonight, we celebrate that love, unconditional, unwavering, and deeply shared. The minister steps aside slightly, nodding toward Michael. Michael, would you like to begin? Michael smiles softly, his hands tightening just a fraction around Sarah's. When I first met you, he begins, his voice steady, I thought you were beautiful, smart, and way out of my league. A ripple of laughter moves through the small crowd, and Sarah smiles, her eyes glinting with emotion. But it didn't take long for me to see what really made you incredible. The way you care so deeply, the way you love not just people, but every part of the world around you. Max, he's been part of that. He's been part of our story since the very beginning, and standing here now with him and with you, I know I'm the luckiest man alive. I promise to love you the way you've taught me to love, completely, without hesitation, and with a loyalty that never falters. Sarah's breath catches, a tear sliding down her cheek. She brushes it away quickly, laughing softly at her own reaction. The minister turns to her, and she nods, signaling she's ready. When we met, Sarah begins, her voice trembling slightly, but growing stronger with each word, I knew right away that you were special, not just because you were kind to me, but because you were kind to Max. I watched how you cared for him, how you loved him like he was yours before he ever really was. That's when I knew you don't just love people, you love with your whole heart. And I promise to do the same for you, to love you with everything I have, to stand by you through every challenge, and to cherish every moment we share, no matter where or how life takes us. As she finishes, Max shifts slightly on his blanket. His tail thumps once, weak but unmistakable. The sound draws soft laughter from the group, and even the minister chuckles lightly, shaking his head. "Well," he says, "if that's not a sign of approval, I don't know what is." The room grows quiet again as the minister's expression turns solemn. "By the power vested in me and witnessed by your loved ones, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Michael, you may kiss your bride." Michael leans forward, cupping Sarah's face gently as he kisses her. The crowd claps softly, some wiping tears from their eyes. As they pull apart, Sarah immediately crouches down, reaching for Max. Her hand rests on his head, her fingers brushing lightly over his ears. "You're a good boy, Max," she whispers, her voice filled with both gratitude and love. "You're always going to be my good boy." Max's tail thumps once more, and though his eyes remain half closed, there's a quiet peace in his expression. The night feels heavy with meaning, a moment that may not have been planned, but carries a depth no grand venue could have offered. When Max came home from the clinic that night, life shifted in ways no one had anticipated. The rhythm of the household softened, reshaped by his needs, and the quiet realization that time was no longer infinite. Mornings started slower. The kitchen became a place of gentle routines, meals prepared with care, medicines mixed into bowls of chicken and rice, and soft encouragement whispered by those who loved him. Max, once eager to leap at the sound of his name, now approached with deliberate steps, his tail wagging faintly in gratitude for the effort they made. Afternoons brought small adventures. Walks that had once spanned entire parks were now shorter, more deliberate. Max moved at his own pace, stopping to sniff the breeze or lie down on the cool grass when his legs needed rest. There was no rush. Each step was an acknowledgement of his resilience, his quiet determination to enjoy what remained. Evenings became sacred. The fireplace glowed as he lay on his favorite blanket, his body curled comfortably while the sound of voices filled the room. Someone would stroke his fur, the motion slow and steady, as if to assure him that he was safe, that he was loved. His eyes would flutter closed, not out of weariness, but contentment. There were harder days, of course. Days when his legs struggled to hold him, when his breath came in shallow bursts, and when his gaze seemed distant, as though searching for strength he could no longer summon. On those days, the house grew quieter. The people around him worked to ease his pain, their voices low and soothing, their hands always near. The seasons passed in a blur of small joys and quiet milestones. Summer gave way to fall, and fall to winter. Holidays were celebrated not with grand gestures, but with moments steeped in simplicity. A warm meal shared by the fire, a soft bed laid near the couch, and the constant presence of those who cared for him. Max's world became smaller, yet richer. He didn't need the sprawling parks or long runs of his youth. What he valued now was time spent close, surrounded by the people who had made his life so full. In his quiet way, Max taught those around him what love truly meant. It wasn't about the grand gestures or the perfect plans. It was about presence, the steady, unwavering commitment to be there, to care, even when it was hard. He showed them that love wasn't measured by the length of time, but by the depth of the moments shared. And as the days grew shorter, so too did his time. But Max didn't leave behind sadness or regret. What lingered instead was the understanding that love, in all its forms, is worth every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every tear shed. His life had been a gift, a reminder to cherish what mattered most, and to live fully in the moments that could never be reclaimed. The evening carried a quiet stillness, the kind that feels like the world holding its breath. Outside the window, the last rays of spring sunlight painted the room in soft gold, filtering through curtains that swayed gently with the breeze. The warmth of the season lingered in the air, but inside the house, time seemed to move differently, every moment suspended. Max lay on a thick blanket near the fireplace, his body stretched out as if every motion had become too heavy to carry. His breaths were shallow now, deliberate, each one drawing a faint rise and fall from his chest. The years had taken their toll, but even now there was a quiet dignity about him. The room was filled with love, not the loud, boisterous kind, but the steady, unwavering presence of those who had made his life whole. Sarah sat close to him, her arms cradling his head gently, her touch light but constant. Michael knelt nearby, his hand resting on Max's back, the slow rhythm of his movements a silent reassurance. Dr. Peterson had arrived an hour earlier, his face calm but tinged with the heaviness of his task. He had known Max almost as long as they had, cared for him through the years, and now he was here for this final act of kindness. The air was filled with soft murmurs, words spoken not to be heard but to comfort. Sarah's voice broke through the quiet, not loud, but steady. She leaned closer, her forehead brushing against Max's, as her tears fell into his fur. "Thank you for everything, Max," she whispered. Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't falter. "For being my protector, my friend, my teacher." Max's eyes, those soulful amber pools that had seen so much, fluttered open briefly. They locked on hers, filled with a depth that spoke of understanding. His tail, now still for hours, gave one final, faint thump against the blanket, a gesture that said more than any word ever could. Dr. Peterson moved gently, explaining each step in a low, soothing tone, though no one asked for details. His hands were practiced and sure, but there was a softness in the way he worked, a reverence for the life he was helping to ease. Max's breathing slowed. Each exhale grew quieter, lighter, until finally it stopped. The room didn't fill with sobs or cries, only silence, a silence that wrapped around everyone present. Sarah held him close, her tears falling freely now, but her face wasn't consumed by grief. There was sorrow, yes, but also gratitude. Gratitude for the years they'd shared, for the lessons he'd taught her about love, loyalty, and what it meant to show up for someone completely. The sun dipped lower, its golden light fading into the soft hues of dusk. And though Max's body lay still, the room was anything but empty. It was filled with the echoes of his life, the joy he had brought, the comfort he had given, and the love he had shown every single day. It had been a year since Max had left their lives, but his presence lingered in the small moments. A leash hanging by the door, a favorite toy tucked away in a corner, and the quiet echo of his paws on the hardwood floor that Sarah and Michael sometimes thought they could still hear. On a quiet afternoon, Sarah and Michael walked into the local animal shelter, the same place where Max had first found her all those years ago. The air was filled with the soft rustle of movement, the occasional bark, and the hopeful eyes of dogs, waiting for a chance at love. Their steps slowed as they reached the last kennel. Inside lay a golden retriever, his muzzle dusted with grey, his body curled on a worn blanket. His eyes, warm and steady, met theirs with a quiet curiosity, not the bounding eagerness of youth, but the measured calm of experience. The nameplate above the kennel read, Duku age 10. The shelter worker approached, her expression softening as she noticed their interest. "Most people look for puppies or younger dogs," she said quietly. "Duke's been here for a few months now. He's gentle, sweet, but, well, his age tends to make people hesitate." Sarah knelt by the kennel, her fingers reaching through the bars to brush against Duke's fur. He shifted slightly, leaning into her touch as if to say, "I'm still here." Michael stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. "Max taught us that love is worth any sacrifice," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She turned to look at Michael, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Duke deserves that chance too." The shelter worker's eyes glistened as she opened the kennel door, watching as Duke slowly rose and stepped forward. His movements were careful, his body slower than it once had been, but his gaze held a quiet hope. That evening, Duke settled into their home as if he had always belonged there. He found Max's old blanket by the fireplace and lay down with a contented sigh, as though recognizing it as a place that had been loved before. For Sarah and Michael, it wasn't about replacing Max. It never could be. It was about continuing what he had taught them, that love, even when it comes with an expiration date, is always worth sharing. And Duke, in his own gentle way, reminded them that love could begin again, even after loss. After Max, the home Sarah and Michael built became more than just a place to live. It became a haven for love in all its forms. Max had taught them that the depth of a bond isn't measured in time, but in the moments shared and the lives touched. Every year, on the anniversary of their wedding, they returned to the animal shelter, the same place where Sarah had first found Max. But now they came not just as visitors, but as caretakers of the legacy Max had left behind. Each visit brought new supplies: blankets to warm older dogs on cold nights, food for those waiting for a second chance, and toys to bring joy to their days. But it wasn't just what they brought, it was how they stayed. They spent hours in the shelter yard, sitting with senior dogs who had begun to feel forgotten, walking alongside them at their slower paces, as if to say, "You matter." In their home, the reminders of Max were ever present. His photo hung prominently on the wall, his collar with its tiny bow tie resting beside it. And beside Max's photo was Duke's, the golden retriever who had joined their lives not as a replacement, but as another chapter in their story. Duke, with his quiet grace, had carried forward the lessons Max had taught them: to love fully, to give generously, and to embrace every moment, no matter how fleeting. As the years passed, the shelter became their shared tradition. They planted flowers in its yard, hung small decorations during the holidays, and spent long afternoons simply being there, present for the dogs who needed them most. Each visit wasn't just about honoring Max's memory. It was about ensuring that the love he'd inspired in them continued to grow. The collars of Max and Duke hung side by side in their living room, symbols of the lives that had shaped theirs. And every dog they met after, every tail wagged and paw extended, carried forward the lessons of loyalty, compassion, and unending love. In time, Sarah and Michael came to see their journey not as a series of beginnings and endings, but as a continuum. Max had been their start, Duke their bridge, and every senior dog they met was a reminder that love, in all its forms, was a gift, one worth giving, over and over again. They learned, as Max had shown them, that love isn't defined by its length, but by the hearts it touches. And as long as they lived, they vowed to keep touching those hearts, one paw print at a time. Years had passed, and the once new home of Sarah and Michael had grown into a space filled with life. The walls carried the laughter of children, the faint scratches of paws on wood, and the quiet echoes of the lessons that had shaped their family. On a quiet evening, the living room glowed warmly. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, its light flickering over photographs on the mantel, pictures of Max, Duke, and the many dogs that had graced their lives since. A well-worn blanket lay folded nearby, one that had belonged to Max, preserved like a cherished keepsake. Sarah and Michael sat together on the couch, their children, 2 bright-eyed boys and a younger girl, curled up around them. A scrapbook rested on the coffee table, its pages filled with photos and clippings. One photo, yellowed slightly with age, showed Max, his bow-tie collar neatly in place, lying at Sarah's feet on their wedding day. As they spoke, the children listened intently, their small faces lighting up with wonder at the stories of a dog they'd never met, but had always known through their parents' love. The family's story wasn't just about Max or Duke or the dogs that followed. It was about the legacy of love they carried forward. It was about teaching the next generation to see love not as something fleeting, but as something powerful, something worth cherishing, even when it meant letting go. In the end, Max's greatest gift wasn't the memories he left behind, but the lessons that continued to shape the lives of those he'd touched. Lessons about loyalty, kindness, and the quiet, unshakable strength of unconditional love.